join us today, and we're so glad that all of you have signed up for virtual homecoming throughout the weekend. My name is Alex Heron. For anybody who does not know me, I'm the Assistant Director of Alumni and Parent Engagement on the DeLand campus of Stetson, and I'm a proud Hatter myself. Class of 2016 out of the School of Business. Hello, Monica. And then, so we're just really excited that you all could be here today, and throughout the weekend, we're so excited at the response we've gotten since moving to the virtual homecoming format. We're up to over 1,000 registrants for our events throughout the weekend, which is exciting. We'll have upwards of 350 people on the call here today, which is awesome. So I did, before we get started, just want to give a couple quick notes before we go into the presentation. So some events that you'll see throughout the weekend, a couple highlights. Tonight on our Facebook page, the Stetson University Alumni Association page at 7:30, you'll see the School of Music Hatter Heritage Concert. That'll premiere on our Facebook page, and you can also watch it in your attendee hub that you signed into. And then tomorrow morning as well, Coffee with the President and the Alumni Awards presentation event. That'll be tomorrow morning at 10:30 a.m. You'll see that on our Facebook page as well, or you can watch it in the attendee hub. And then remember, if you are celebrating a class reunion, if your class year ends in a 0 or a 5, we have a reunion event set up for you. So be sure to check out the full schedule and make sure you sign up for your reunion. We got a lot of fun trivia and all kinds of games planned for those. So those are going to be exciting. Very excited for those. We've also got Greek life reunions, Bonner alumni reunions, happy hour events, School of Business events, arts and sciences, and athletics update. And then we've got a Green Feather virtual 5K, got all kinds of great stuff happening. And then let's see, we're testing out our chat box early. Will the School of Music concert remain on the Facebook page? Yes, it will. So you'll be able to watch it afterwards as well if you can't watch it at 7:30. And then we'll close out the weekend on Sunday with homecoming chapel at 10:30, and then a yoga and meditation session at 11:30 in the morning. So we've got amazing events throughout the weekend. I think we've got about 35 in total that we're super excited for. And again, we're really glad that all of you could join us for homecoming weekend. So before I turn it over to Sue Ryan, I just want to go over a couple quick Zoom notes. So we are in Zoom webinar today. We're not in a normal Zoom meeting. We're on Zoom webinar. So throughout the presentation, you'll see me and Sue on your screen. And if you have any questions or comments throughout the video or any of the presentation, feel free to chat us in the chat box that you've been using. And then at the end, if you have any questions or comments, I will go ahead and promote you so you can turn on your camera if you do want to ask any questions at the end. But again, I encourage you to use the chat box throughout, and we'll have a really good time kicking off homecoming today. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Sue and let her introduce herself. And many, many thanks to Sue. You should all thank her for wanting to do this event first, because the only other option was to kick off homecoming was me doing a compilation of TikTok dances. So Sue saved you from having to watch any of that. And Sue, I will turn it over to you now.
Well, I'm definitely happy to save them from that, Alex. So, but thanks. I'm Sue Ryan. I'm Dean of the duPont-Ball Library, and one of the best things about being Dean of the Library is that we have the archives in the library, which contains items of university history and history of the surrounding DeLand community. So I've been here 31 years. I'm not a Hatter, but I'm an honorary Hatter. I've made myself an honorary Hatter for serving 31 years at Stetson, but I have a great love for the university, a great love for the university history. I know so many alums after all these years. And I love sharing what I've learned about the university with all of you. And I said at the beginning to the first you who logged in, as you see me speak, behind me, I have pulled items from the archives that belong to the Stetson family, including John B. Stetson's silver desktop set and some hats that the family owned, and Elizabeth's diary, and some medals from John B. Stetson Jr. And you'll hear about some of these things in the video that we're about to watch together. Please put anything you want to know in the chat, and I'll try and answer them, and we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end. So I'm going to pass it back over to Alex and let him start the video we're going to watch.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen in just a second, and we'll play this video. I would encourage everyone watching, if you're watching on your computer or a laptop or anything else, just turn your volume up just a little bit higher than maybe you usually have it to make sure you can hear all the audio in this. I'm going to share my screen, and if anybody has any technical issues throughout, feel free to chat us or chat me privately on Zoom, and I'll try to get it figured out for you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen in just a moment, and we will share this John B. Stetson family legacy with you all. All right, I hope everybody can see that, and then I'll go ahead and start it in just a second.
Stetson University students, to earn cultural credit for this event, listen to the presentation and take the online quiz. A score of 70% or higher will earn cultural credit. The library will report the credit to the registrar's office. Welcome to the John B. Stetson Family Legacy. I'm Sue Ryan, Dean of Stetson University's duPont-Ball Library. I have spent decades researching famed hat maker John B. Stetson and connecting with dozens of his direct descendants. As a result of those friendships developed with Stetson family members, John B. Stetson IV, who is the great-grandson of John B. Stetson, and his wife Solveig donated hundreds of photos and items of memorabilia to Stetson University. And we believe that we now hold the largest collection of John B. Stetson memorabilia in the world in our library archives. This presentation will focus on the early years of Stetson University and the influence and legacy of the university's major benefactor, John B. Stetson, his wife Elizabeth, and their two sons, John B. Jr. and G. Henry Stetson. You'll learn a bit about the Stetson family, and you may come to the same conclusion that I have over the years, that without John B. Stetson, Stetson University would very likely not exist today. So just who were John B. and Elizabeth Stetson? Most people at the university with a passing knowledge of John B. Stetson know that he was married to Elizabeth when he first came to DeLand around the time that the university was founded. But Elizabeth was actually his third wife. In 1850, when John was 20 years old, he married 19-year-old Nancy Haynes. A year later, they had a daughter, Wilhelmina. She was known as Minnie. We don't know how long they were married, but we do know they were eventually divorced and that Nancy was back living with her parents by 1860. We also know that around 1860, John B. Stetson was having health problems and headed west to find fresh air away from the industrial pollution of the East Coast. The story of how John Stetson invented the cowboy hat has been told much like this. John B. Stetson was diagnosed with tuberculosis and needed to get out of the large polluted cities of the East Coast. He eventually winds up in Colorado, and having experience as a hat maker, he fashions a fur felt, all-weather, large-brimmed hat for the cowboys, who were mostly wearing bug-infested coonskin caps at the time. The cowboys loved the Western hat that John made them, and he returns to Philadelphia to start his own hat company. So that's the legend, but no one really knows if it's true or not. First, tuberculosis was a very deadly disease. It was called consumption then because it consumed a person. People with tuberculosis were weak, and a huge percentage of those with the disease at that time died. So I'm skeptical that John B. Stetson headed west on his own with tuberculosis. More likely is that he had some type of lung issue, perhaps brought on by industrial pollution or the chemicals used in his father's hat business. We don't really know. But what we do know is that sometime around 1862, John B. Stetson creates a cowboy hat that would eventually be called the Boss of the Plains. And around 1864, he heads back to Philadelphia and starts his own hat company. Soon after starting his company in 1867, John B. Stetson marries a woman named Harriet Dupuy. Harriet had a 13-year-old daughter, Florence, who was called Flory, and we know that at this time, John's daughter from his first marriage, Minnie, who was about 16 then, was also living with them. Second wife Harriet would die at age 48 after 16 years of marriage. And John would soon after marry his third wife, Elizabeth Shindler, in 1884. At the time of their marriage, John was 59 and Elizabeth was 26. They would go on to have 3 sons. Their middle son, Benjamin, passed away from illness at about 6 years old. And if you are familiar with the chapel in Elizabeth Hall on the Stetson University campus, you may have seen a marble tablet that dedicated that chapel to Benjamin. So let's take a look at John B. Stetson's career as an entrepreneurial hat maker. We know that John's father, Stephen Stetson, was a successful hat maker in New Jersey, and he had established the No Name Hat Company in 1790. So John Stetson was trained as a hat maker from a young age. But John Stetson was the 8th of 12 children, and he had a number of older brothers who would be in line before him to inherit the family business. After he came back from his years out west, it seems logical that he would start his own company. In 1865, the John B. Stetson Company was established in a rented room in Philadelphia. By 1870, he had bought his first factory building, seen on this slide, and his business making all types of hats took off. From 1870 to 1920, the company had rapid growth, employing more than 1,200 workers by 1899 and making John B. Stetson a very rich man. Two principles guided John B. Stetson's company. The first was indenture. That word has a negative connotation, but the practice of indenture was very common at the time. A worker signed a contract, typically 4 years, with John B. Stetson, in which they promised certain things to each other. In this contract from our archives that's seen on the slide, 18-year-old Joseph Katz promises that during the 4 years of his contract, he will not marry, he will refrain from gambling, he will stay out of the bars, and he will not sell hats on the side. In return, John B. Stetson promises to teach Joseph the art, trade, and mystery of, in this case, felt hat finishing. There were many different skills to making a hat, so workers were trained in different parts of the process. To learn this trade, Joseph would be paid $2 a week. The second principle guiding the John B. Stetson Company was paternalism. John B. Stetson was considered an early advocate of providing benefits to his employees, and the John B. Stetson Company was known as a desirable place to work. Employees had access to on-site medical care, hospital, banking services, and loans to build or buy houses. The company also had social events and social groups such as music groups, lavish Christmas parties, and a large auditorium that offered entertainment. After John B. Stetson's death, the company continued and expanded benefits, adding insurance benefits, a dental clinic, Boy Scout troops, and Americanization classes to help immigrant workers become citizens. Let's turn to John B. Stetson's involvement with Stetson University. John Stetson came to DeLand sometime in the mid-1880s and bought up a significant amount of property in and around the town. He built a large winter home on the southwest side of town that sat on about 300 acres of land. He soon became acquainted with Henry DeLand, the town founder, and the founder in 1883 of the DeLand Academy, a prep school that would expand into DeLand College in 1885 and renamed DeLand University 2 years later in 1887. John B. Stetson quickly embraced Henry DeLand's vision of creating a quality university in Florida, a state that had very few options for higher education at the time. By 1887, John Stetson had joined the University Board of Trustees and was named president of the board 2 years later. This began a decades-long relationship in which John B. Stetson and his family supported the university with large financial gifts. In gratitude for his generosity, the university was renamed John B. Stetson University in 1889. Not only did John Stetson give cash gifts, but he also gave land on which to build the early campus buildings. In 1889, the entire university was housed in DeLand Hall, the classrooms, the offices, the lab and library space, and even some dormitory space. The university quickly outgrew the building, and John Stetson donated the majority of the money to build the first campus dormitory, named Stetson Hall for its benefactor. It has the male students on one side and the female students on the other side of the building. Shortly after Stetson Hall was constructed, John Stetson donated the land and built a large residence for University President John Forbes and his family just across the street from Stetson Hall. This building served as the president's home from 1890 all the way to 1948. It was later named Holmes Hall in honor of trustee and donor Robert Holmes. In the photo at the upper left of this slide, Holmes Hall can be seen with Elizabeth Hall cupola in the background. The lower right photo shows the interior of the home, considered very large and luxurious for the time. If you're familiar with the Stetson campus today, Holmes Hall sat where the duPont-Ball Library now sits, but it faced north. This is one of my favorite photos in the university archives. This photo was taken on the front porch of the president's home, or Holmes Hall, looking across Minnesota Avenue at Stetson Hall. Now it's the site of that beautiful green space behind the Welcome Center. John B. Stetson continued to help expand the campus, funding the construction of a large building that housed classrooms. It was named Elizabeth Hall in honor of his wife, Elizabeth. In this slide, you see the architectural drawing of Elizabeth Hall, and you might notice that it looks very much like the building we know today. Elizabeth Hall was built, however, without the north and south wings that you see in the drawing. This was a cost-saving measure, and the building was designed to be built in stages. Here you see the building under construction in 1891 without the wings. This photo dates from 1894 and shows the west side of the completed building, also without the wings. Several years later, the wings were added, and these photos show two views of the west side from a lot across the street where Flagler Hall now sits. Elizabeth Hall was the scene of many early group photos, but one of the most interesting is one taken in 1895 of the Stetson faculty with John B. Stetson. Although it is hard to believe that a man who spent his whole life making hats would not have had many photos of himself in hats, this is the only known photo of John B. Stetson actually wearing a hat. Standing next to John B. Stetson with his arms crossed is then University President John Forbes. As the student body grew, the need for more dormitory space increased as well. The next campus building to be constructed was Chaudoin Hall in 1892, named for University trustee W.N. Chaudoin, who was secretary of the Florida Baptist Convention, with whom the university was affiliated at the time. Reverend Chaudoin was also the first person to receive a Stetson honorary degree. This architectural drawing originally called this dorm Somnus Hall, Latin for sleep. Once again, construction of the building was possible only through the generosity of major donor John B. Stetson. Just as with Elizabeth Hall, Chaudoin was built in stages. This is what Chaudoin looked like before the wings were attached. When the north wing was added 2 years after construction, it included a kitchen and dining room. The south wing would not be constructed until more than 30 years later. As I hope you can tell, John B. Stetson's contributions to the early growth of the campus were essential. There were few people in Central Florida at the time who had the wealth to devote to building a college. Along with the buildings already shown, John B. Stetson funded the first gymnasium. We know that he gave at least $7 million in cash, in today's dollars, to the fledgling university, along with land. But he also paid salaries and bills when cash was short. He established endowments to pay the faculty. And he gave goods such as a horse and a wagon, a stereopticon, and oranges from his groves. The Stetson Archives holds ledgers in which all of John B. Stetson's gifts were entered by hand. John B. Stetson's generosity extended beyond his company and the university, however. He owned the College Arms Hotel in DeLand, which is seen at the bottom left of this slide, and he helped build the road between DeLand and Orange City. He attended and supported the First Baptist Church in DeLand, and of course he built his winter estate in the town. The two photos on the right picture John B. Stetson's home as it was in the late 1880s and as it looks today. Standing in front of what is today known as the Stetson Mansion are John B. Stetson IV and his wife Solveig, who reside in Philadelphia. John B. Stetson was at his DeLand home in February 1906 when he unexpectedly died of a stroke at age 75. The university had lost not only its largest donor, but the president of its board of trustees and one of its greatest friends. Second Stetson President Lincoln Hulley accompanied Elizabeth Stetson and John B. Stetson's body back to Philadelphia by train. Papers around the nation published John B. Stetson's obituary. Hundreds of those obituaries are in a bound volume in the Stetson Library archives. With John B. Stetson's death, Elizabeth Stetson found herself a widow at 48 years old after 22 years of marriage. We don't know a lot about Elizabeth's early years, except that she grew up in Indiana and traveled to Philadelphia in her 20s, we believe, to study music. While While John Stetson had little formal education, Elizabeth was educated, and she was especially fond of music and the arts. She volunteered at the hospital associated with the Stetson Company, and that is likely how she met John Stetson. After Stetson's death, Elizabeth rarely visited DeLand, but she continued the family's generous gifts to the university. She gave at least $1.5 million in cash in today's dollars, donated many pianos, funded the Cummings Gymnasium that replaced the small gym her husband had built years before, and she was the primary donor to the Sampson Library. Before the Sampson Library was built, the library had always been in a room or a few rooms in other campus buildings, first in DeLand Hall, then in Elizabeth Hall. The addition of a freestanding library marked a big step forward in the university's development into a modern institution of higher learning. Second President Lincoln Hawley worked hard to get wealthy industrialist Andrew Carnegie to build Stetson a library. In the early 1900s, Carnegie was funding the building of libraries across the country, mostly public libraries, but he also did fund some academic libraries. Hawley applied for Carnegie funding and was approved to receive $40,000. But every Carnegie academic library loan came with a catch. The university had to match the amount of money that Carnegie gave. The university had nowhere near $40,000, which in today's equivalent would be about $1.1 million, to match Carnegie's funds. So Hawley eventually turned to his most reliable source of donations, the Stetson family. Elizabeth agreed to provide the matching funds, and Stetson's first library building was opened in 1908. Rather than name the library for Carnegie or for Elizabeth, the library was named for C.T. Sampson, a businessman and trustee who had long been contributing money for library books. Sampson gave a $10,000 endowment to fund library books upon his death, and more than 110 years later, that endowment still provides funds for library materials each year. This slide shows several views of the Sampson Library, which is today known as Sampson Hall, which anchored the second center courtyard of the university, along with Holmes Hall to one side and Elizabeth Hall to the other. Conrad Hall had been built in 1901 as the third dormitory on campus, but it had burned down just 2 years later. In 1909, Elizabeth and her son, John B. Stetson Jr., funded the rebuilding of Conrad Hall that still serves as a dormitory today. Elizabeth was an interesting woman. She had many volunteer and philanthropic activities. She was an active member of the Philadelphia Society, serving on the Stetson Hospital Board and participating in the company's Red Cross, as well as many other civic organizations. As a relatively young and wealthy widow, she was probably seen as a highly desirable potential match by many. 2 years after John B. Stetson's death, Elizabeth would remarry, and her second marriage generated quite a bit of gossip and attention. At some time after John B. Stetson's death, Elizabeth was introduced to a Portuguese count named Alexis, the Count of Santa Eulalia. The count had an estate in Portugal, but apparently spent time in the United States as well. After Elizabeth announced the marriage, which was covered by the Philadelphia papers and the New York Times, hints of scandal began to appear in the press. A woman from Chicago, a Mrs. Ernest, claimed that she had made a deal with the count to help him woo Elizabeth by writing his love letters for him, buying him good clothing, and coaching him through the courtship. If the courtship was successful and resulted in marriage, Mrs. Ernest said that the count had agreed to pay her for her assistance. The story hit the papers, and both Elizabeth and the count issued strong denials. Both said that they had never even met the woman. Friends and family supported Elizabeth, and little evidence existed that the woman's claims were true. But the rumors persisted that this marriage was not one of love, but one of convenience. The count, who was land rich but cash poor, would gain access to Elizabeth's fortune. And Elizabeth, by remarrying, would have full control of her money, which was, typical of the times, administered by men named by John B. Stetson before his death. Despite the rumors, Elizabeth and the count moved forward with their lives, sailing to Portugal soon after they were married. Elizabeth was now known as Elizabeth, the Countess of Santa Eulalia, and the pair socialized with the European elite. They traveled between Gloria, which was the name of the Count's estate in Portugal, and Philadelphia. But we believe that most of their time was spent at the Stetson estate, which was called Edro, on the outskirts of Philadelphia. The Count was an accomplished artist. If you're familiar with Stetson campus, the bronze relief of Henry DeLand that sits on the front of Sampson Hall was created by the Count and later gifted to the university. So he presumably was creating works of art as well as tending to his business affairs in Portugal. Elizabeth kept busy with her many different volunteer activities in Philadelphia, and she sometimes accompanied the Count on his trips to Europe and sometimes remained home in the United States. One of the gifts that Stetson Library received from John B. Stetson IV was Elizabeth's 1917 diary. Written in her hand, it provides a fascinating look into Elizabeth's daily life and marriage to the Count. We learn that after 9 years of marriage, the spring of 1917 found Alexis at his estate in Portugal and Elizabeth in Philadelphia. Elizabeth received word that Alexis had had a carriage accident on his estate and he was very ill. While he wrote to Elizabeth that he was feeling somewhat better, his doctors were worried about him. At the time, Elizabeth planned to sail to Portugal to be with Alexis, but she was struggling with her own health, as she described it, an attack of influenza. As she was recovering, she received a cable from Alexis' doctor telling her that Alexis was incurable and that she needed to come to Portugal right away. While she said she dreaded the journey, she starts preparing for a long ocean voyage and months abroad. She has her dressmaker make Black Widow's dresses and hats, meets with John B. Stetson Company Red Cross to organize them during her absence, and heads to New York by train on April 27, 1917. The next day, she is on the USS Lorraine with 100 first-class passengers, only 5 of them women. With Elizabeth is her close friend, and we believe her personal assistant, Thomasine Potter. It is interesting to note that Elizabeth's oldest son, John B. Stetson Jr., would name one of his daughters Thomasine, probably indicating the closeness of Thomasine to the family. It must be remembered that to reach her husband's side, Elizabeth is crossing the Atlantic in the middle of World War I, which was dangerous and must have been difficult. On the ship are 85 young men who are headed to the war zones in France to serve in the ambulance service. Also on the ship, a deserter from the French army, a French aviator, and a Belgian priest heading to the war front. According to Elizabeth, the only topic of conversation on the ship is the war. The seas are rough, it rains, and everyone is in a serious mood. On May 6, a week into the trip, the captain tells everyone to keep their life belts near and not to remove their clothing. That same day, 2 days before landing, Elizabeth receives a cable that her husband Alexis has died. She has not made it in time. The next day, all passengers were required to be on the deck with life belts on. After a harrowing 48 hours, the ship lands in Bordeaux on May 8th, but Elizabeth's trip is not complete. She still has 3 more days of travel to get to Portugal via train. On May 15th, more than 2 weeks after leaving New York, Elizabeth visits Gloria, their Portuguese estate. She goes to the estate for a short visit and says that she was too sad to take notice of all the changes because this is nothing to me without Alexis. The sadness about his death comes through clearly in her writings. The diary provides evidence of a woman who truly cared for Alexis, who was very concerned that he was well cared for during his final days, and who missed him. So despite the persistent rumors that theirs was a marriage of convenience, I have come to believe that this was a real marriage between 2 people who cared for each other. Elizabeth would remain in Portugal for 5 months, settling the affairs of the estate, after which she returned to Philadelphia and resumed her work with various civic organizations. Elizabeth never remarried and would live to the age of 70. She died at her Western estate in California, survived by her 2 sons and her 6 grandchildren. Let's turn now to John B. Stetson and Elizabeth's oldest son, John B. Stetson Jr. John Jr., who was just 22 years old when his father died, was somewhat of a Renaissance man and very accomplished in several areas of life. He was a Harvard-educated historian and rare book collector who was very involved in the early days of the Florida State Historical Society. At the same time, he retained a robust business career, serving as a director at the John B. Stetson Company, manufacturing safety razors, establishing a brokerage firm, and attaining a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. But John Jr. did much more during his lifetime. He had a successful military career, beginning as a flight instructor in World War I, and then serving in both the Marine Corps and the Army in World War II. John Jr. had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, and he lost both of his sons during World War II. Many believe that it was the death of his son in 1941 that precipitated his re-entry into the military. During World War II, he served as a fiscal advisor for the commanding general in Iran and was acquainted at this time with the Shah of Iran. In the 1920s, John Jr. held political posts. He was part of the U.S. delegation that attended the reinterment of the remains of Pedro Menendez de Aviles in Spain. Menendez had discovered St. Augustine and was revered in his hometown of Aviles. Although it is somewhat difficult to imagine today how important this reinterment was to the Spanish people, we know that John Jr.'s participation is well known and well respected there even today. Aviles tourism officials have visited the Stetson University campus several times in the last decade and have expressed tremendous respect for the legacy of John Jr. Soon after the reinterment, President Coolidge appointed John Jr. as a U.S. minister to Finland. He never served in that position, however, and he was almost immediately also appointed as U.S. minister to Poland. John Jr. did serve in this position for 5 years, and evidence suggests that he was popular with the Polish people. To this day, the university still gets requests from Poland for photos and information about John Jr.'s time serving that country. Like his parents, John Jr. contributed to Stetson University throughout his adult life. Following his father's death, John Jr. assumed the position of president of the university trustees at the young age of 22. He would ultimately serve on the board for 46 years, 34 of those as president. He gave the equivalent of at least $1.7 million in today's dollars. Like his father, he gave in other ways as well, establishing an endowment, paying the salary of a history professor, donating many quality books to the library, and contributing to the Phi Kappa Delta House. Interestingly, it was John Jr. who donated to the university the bronze relief of Henry DeLand that his stepfather, the Count, had created. John Jr. is seen on this slide with Ruby, his wife of 45 years, in front of Elizabeth Hall. John B. Stetson Jr. died in 1952 at the age of 68, leaving behind an impressive legacy of his own. He was survived by his wife, 2 of his 4 children, and 10 grandchildren. The youngest son of John B. Stetson and Elizabeth was by all accounts the complete opposite of his older brother. While John Jr. was an intellectual with a wide variety of pursuits, G. Henry Stetson was the playboy of the family, living mostly in California, where he was known to move in the circles of the Hollywood and Southern California elite, whom he loved to entertain at his ranch. He was known as something of a drinker and also known to have a temper and to be quite stubborn. In fact, when the Stetson Company started to experience hard times in the 1960s, due mostly to men's hats going out of fashion, the family tried to sell the company, and it was Henry who blocked the sale. A long court battle ensued, and the company was ultimately sold, but many believe that Henry's stubbornness resulted in the family members losing much of the potential wealth that would have come with a more timely sale. Henry worked for the John B. Stetson Company like his brother, serving as a company director and calling himself an industrialist. He often traveled internationally, promoting the company's hats to its many foreign customers. Also like his brother, he was a longtime member of the Stetson University Board of Trustees, serving for 51 years from the age of 26. After his retirement, he was honored as a trustee emeritus for an additional 19 years until his death. He donated at least $46,000 in today's dollars to the university. At the lower left of this slide, Henry is seen at a commencement ceremony in 1951 with Stetson President J. Ollie Edmonds and Helen DeLand, the daughter of university founder Henry DeLand. At the right is Henry with third wife Sevilla outside of Elizabeth Hall. Henry's 300-acre citrus ranch was well known in the San Fernando Valley in California. Built in 1926 when Henry was 39 years old, he called it, fittingly, Rancho Sombrero, or the Hat Ranch. On this slide, you see a matchbook from the ranch. This item is housed in the archives at the Stetson University Library. At the time, the ranch boasted the country's largest swimming pool in a private residence, holding 1 million gallons of water. During World War II, when it was difficult to get chemicals to clean the pool, it was stocked with fish for Henry's friends to use as a fishing hole. One of Henry's great-great-granddaughters visited Stetson University not long ago and told us she remembers going to the ranch when she was young, and it was an amazing place. Roy Richardson, the son of the man who managed the ranch for Henry, grew up on ranch property, and he said it was absolutely fabulous. It was one of the most fantastic places I've ever seen. He said that Henry's second wife, Lucretia, to whom he was married for 10 years, from 1920 to 1930, was thought to be trying to create a small version of the Hearst Castle. The main house had a hotel-sized kitchen, servants' quarters, and beautiful custom furniture. Henry, a car aficionado, had many cars, some of which are seen at lower left in the large 9-car garage. He was known to favor high-end Lincoln automobiles. While the ranch was always thought to be owned by Henry, we found out in recent years, after the family gave us Elizabeth's will for our collection, that it was actually owned by his mother Elizabeth, who visited and sometimes stayed at the ranch. Elizabeth did leave the ranch to Henry in her will, but as Henry got older, he either decided to downsize or perhaps could not afford to keep the ranch going financially. In any case, he sold much of the property to the Mormon Church in the late 1950s, with the caveat that Henry would keep his home and live on the ranch until his death. In 1963, however, a wildfire on the property, followed by heavy rains, caused a mudslide, filling the home and massive pool with mud. Henry and his third wife, Sibylla, were away at the time, but they returned home to find devastating damage. They would never live at the ranch again. They moved to a home in Woodland Hills, where Henry would die in 1983 at the age of 95. Sometime in the late 1970s, after the property had been further destroyed by the 1971 Sylmar earthquake, the Mormon Church sold the property to a gentleman who used it to build a large mobile home park. Today, a freeway runs through the property, and it is mostly very developed. But years ago, 29 acres were set aside for horse riding. The area is known as Stetson Ranch Park, and it is still today a small rural oasis surrounded by urban growth. The legacy of the Stetson family runs deep. If you believe, like I do, that the university may not have survived its early years without the help of the Stetsons, all of the thousands of alumni and all of us who have built careers at the university owe the family a debt of gratitude. The family's own legacy, however, is seen in their family tree. We believe that we have identified every direct descendant of John B. Stetson and Elizabeth Stetson. That's 121 people who have gone on to each have a legacy of their own. The green blocks represent people on John Jr.'s side, and the orange blocks are descendants of Henry. The red circle that you see represents Jack Batterson Stetson. Jack, who is now 15 years old and the great-great-great-grandson of John Batterson Stetson, is the last male on the family tree with the last name Stetson. We are also working with family members of John B. Stetson's daughter, Minnie, whom he had with his first wife, and we've identified 27 direct descendants on that branch of the family, seen here in yellow. I thank the Stetson family for the generosity of their time and their memories to help us learn more about those who influenced early Stetson University history. Thanks also to the sources seen on this final slide. If you are a Stetson student who would like to receive cultural credit for this presentation, please take the short online quiz to complete the requirements for credit.
All right, that was a great history lesson, and I know everybody is prepared now to pass the quiz that's coming up next after we're done. I'm kidding. But if anybody has any questions or comments for us or anything for Sue specifically on this presentation, feel free to chat them in now in the chat box that you've been using. So go ahead and drop in any questions or comments you might have. Or if you have the raise hand function on your Zoom, feel free to use that and I can turn your microphone on or allow you to turn your microphone on and you can ask your question. Feel free to drop them in the chat box though, getting a lot of positive feedback. Thank you, Sue.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. It's just fun to do this kind of research. So it's one of the best parts of this job, I can tell you that.
It is, and I have seen this presentation a number of times and I love it every time. Okay, we do have one
So I see from Todd. So does the archives have any material about Elizabeth Stetson's alleged coup attempt in Portugal? You know, no, we don't. And we don't believe that that's true. We believe that that's another story about Elizabeth. And some of you may have heard about one of our students, or maybe many of you have not. It was pretty well publicized in some of the Stetson literature, but one of our students, Jessica Algieri, who graduated a couple of years ago and was a library student assistant, did extensive research into Elizabeth's life. And she got a hold of the diary and just became fascinated and applied for a SURE grant here at Stetson, which is a grant that students can do some research with over the summer. And she actually went to Portugal, and she went to the estate, and she went to the archives, and she talked to people. And it was really quite an amazing research project for an undergraduate. And so she agrees with us that we don't think there was a real coup attempt in Portugal. Did the Stetson family contribute to the School of Music? Well, yes and no. I don't know about the development of the music school, but they definitely contributed. And Elizabeth, as I said in the presentation, gave many pianos, but then descendants of Elizabeth, the Louis Stetson Allen side of the family, who was on the G. Henry side of the family, provided some wonderful cash gifts to the School of Music that have helped supplement them. So I know the family did always have interest in the music school. Sorry, I'm trying to read the chat, and maybe you can help me, Alex, and talk at the same time.
Yeah,
so, the DePue family and DeLand, I don't think there's anything there, Melissa. We didn't find anything in the genealogy to indicate a connection there.
We had another one. Rena asked, Sue, what discovery in this research was the most exciting for you, if you can identify one?
Well, I think the juxtaposition of the two boys is fascinating. You know, the intellectual versus the playboy. That was a lot of fun. But it's Elizabeth for sure. I think I would love to see other people look into Elizabeth's life. I wish we could find out more about her, because I just think she's fascinating. And once I read her diary, I felt a real connection to her. And I know Jessica, our student, felt that connection too.
Awesome. And we did have another one come in from Monica. Is the Stetson Hall dorm the one that was in the center of campus?
That's right. That's where the green space is now. And it sat right next to the library where I am sitting at this moment. And, you know, that building had to come down because of structural issues. Here's a funny story about Stetson Hall. So when I first came to Stetson, you know, over 30 years ago, one of the Stetson Descendants and one of the DeLand Descendants, two female students, both came to Stetson at the same time. And somebody in admissions thought, oh, wouldn't it be great to make them roommates and put them in Stetson Hall, which was probably the worst dorm physically, you know, at the time. So I wasn't sure about the wisdom of that. But of course, the story is very predictable. They didn't get along. And the Stetson descendant did not graduate. And there's another interesting tidbit there. There has never been a Stetson descendant that has graduated from Stetson University. We've had two who have attended. A father and a daughter team attended, but the father got kicked out for bad behavior, which the family thinks is very funny. So I'm not telling tales on them. And he's still alive, and he knows that he should have probably been kicked out. And then his daughter was the one who came and roomed with the DeLand person.
Awesome. And before we get to the next question, President Rolke did join us today. So hello, President Rolke. And he said hello to everybody. We're happy to have you for your first homecoming here at Stetson. He did leave a comment, very self-serving, but John B. Stetson and your 10th president were born in the very same city, Orange, New Jersey. That's a new Stetson trivia question for the future.
Definitely.
And then another one came in from Tom. Elizabeth was a colonial dame. The organization still thrives. Do you find that it generates any interest in Stetson women?
I haven't had any inquiries from that avenue. The big avenue that we have is the Stetson Kindred Society, they're a huge group, and they're not just the John B. Stetson branch, but all of the Stetson branches, so all the cousins, and we get a lot of inquiries from them. They're very active.
Awesome. And Sherry, I know you asked about this presentation. I can connect with you afterwards to get you a copy of this if you do want to watch it again.
Yeah, we can send out links to this, and we have some other history presentations if alums are interested as well.
Yes, we have this one, and then we have a couple more presentations that are awesome, and they're all on YouTube. I can get everybody that wants those a copy of those if they would like. We did have another question come in from Todd. Is the Stetson Mansion still open for tours? I know the guys who restored it had it for sale at one point recently.
Yeah, it's still for sale. It's been for sale for a number of years. They do have the tours still going. They're limited, obviously, because of the COVID, but they do have limited tours going. I think, that house is, for those of you who have been there, it's absolutely beautiful. And I got an opportunity to live on the property for a month and caretake it while the owners were in Europe. So I know every inch of that property. And it does not sit in a really desirable neighborhood comparable to what the house is itself. So there are not other mansions or large houses surrounding it anymore. In fact, it's got, an oil changing place on one side of it. So that is a problem with them trying to sell it. When you go in, it's magical and you forget what's around it. But there's a very limited number of people, I think, who would want to take that house on, which is why it stayed for sale for so long.
Awesome. We did a couple folks chatting in the chat box asking about Stetson Hall. What year was Stetson Hall torn down? We did have someone comment.
2011, I want to say.
Okay.
Off the top of my head, don't make me swear to it, but I think around 2011.
We did have a couple people in the comments mention summer 2000.
There we go. So that's correct.
Yes, everybody will get the links afterwards if you would like. Absolutely. I can connect with you all afterwards. We did have someone say it was just meant to be for Dr. Wilkie to be here now.
It absolutely was.
Fantastic presentation. Thank you all so much. Thank you for joining. If anybody has any final questions before we log out of this one, feel free to drop them in the chat. We would love to answer them for you.
Yeah. I so appreciate all the nice comments, and the links we'll send out. The second video is one about the story of Sampson Hall, which is actually my favorite story of all the videos I did about Lincoln Hulley trying to get Andrew Carnegie to fund it. It's a fascinating story. One of the other videos is the Stetson presidents. So the first 8 Stetson presidents, and then I put one up last night for the students that I'm happy to share as well on the history of the campus buildings. So there would be a total of 4, and I'll count on Alex to get those links out to you.
Yes, absolutely. And this might have been missed earlier. I know, Sue, you commented in the chat box earlier, but it might have been missed because it did come in again. Did John B. have any position concerning racial matters?
Yeah, and I answered it in the chat this way. We don't know, of course, what his personal feelings were. We have no diaries. There's no definitive biography on John B. Stetson, so he really is a man of mystery. But what we do know is what I said about how he treated immigrants and the workers in his factory, and we've never found a shred of evidence that there was any issues there, and that nothing but John B. wanted to encourage people to become American citizens, to buy homes. He was giving loans out for people to buy or build homes, and building the hospitals. He seemed genuinely to really care about his workers. And in talking to John B. Stetson IV, who is now in his 80s, who worked for the company when he was younger, he said there's just nothing that ever came up that John B. Stetson's workers weren't really grateful to be working there. And you can tell from some of the data we had that families would work there over generations and they would stay their entire careers. So I'm hoping that indicates that it was a good place to work and that he did treat his workers fairly, and there were not these problems with race relations and immigrant relations that we saw in other companies.
Right, thank you. And Luis asked, is there a copy of the presentation that the student who got the SURE grant did, or a copy of the report itself?
Yes, and I'll get you a link to that as well, and I'll pass it through Alex.
Okay, great. So everybody asking about links to either the video we watched today or any of the other videos that we have. I have a list of all of you that registered and attended this event. So I'll be sure to anybody who wants it, I will make sure you get those links afterwards, probably sometime next week after we wrap up homecoming, but I will definitely make sure that you all get the links to those recordings.
Yes, and there were really alligators, and we've got pictures of them on the estate. So definitely kept alligators. And if you drive by now, you can still see remnants of the alligator pit. It's not on mansion property anymore. That mansion started out on 300 acres. It's shrunk down to, you know, just a big piece of property now. But right behind it in the neighborhood, you can still see the alligator pit.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you all for joining. We so appreciate you taking the time to join us today, and we're happy that you all have registered and joined Homecoming 2020. We know that obviously this is not the way we intended to spend it this year, but we're happy that you all have embraced the virtual setting. We're very excited. Again, another shameless plug. Make sure you tune in for the Hatter Heritage concert tonight. That'll be at 7:30. Tomorrow morning at 10:30, you can hear from President Rolke. He'll give a university update, and we will present our 2020 Alumni Awards. And then make sure you sign up for any other events you see on the schedule throughout the weekend that might be exciting for you. Class reunions, Greek life reunions. We've got an athletics update later this afternoon. And yes, good question, Sherry, on reunions. We do plan on celebrating this year's class reunions in person as well next year. As long as we can gather together next year, we are very excited to host next year's reunions and celebrate this year's reunions in an in-person setting next year. Thank you for that question. And again, thank you all for joining us. I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions at Homecoming. I'll see many of you on some others, but thank you again. Thank you, Sue. This was wonderful. Thank you for taking the time to do this. And happy Homecoming, and go Hatters, everybody.
Happy homecoming.